not surprised that we're starting to get more and more questions about the future of Pierre-Luc Dubois, the priority of signing him, and what it will cost, assuming that he's open to a long-term deal, to get that done. I'm not sure that a strong World Championship performances changes it much. It's certainly anything that he did certainly wasn't hurting it. But he still remains number one priority in the non-coach department for the Winnipeg Jets, Murat. How do you see this coming together? And let's just talk about what it would cost right now for the Winnipeg Jets to get Dubois on a long-term deal, and whether we want to talk it 6 years, 7 years, even 8 years. How do you think that comes together, and how expensive will it be for the Winnipeg Jets if they want to succeed in keeping a guy they gave up a ton of assets to acquire?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. The World Championships won't change anything, really. Winnipeg knows he's good. Pierre-Luc Dubois knows he's good. We won't be surprised by the fact that he was quality in that situation and in a small sample, but great that he played great. When it comes to his contract situation, the easiest and simplest thing to recognize is that it's going to take a little bit of time, maybe like Trotz as well. As much as Jets fans would like a little bit of certainty there, and I'm sure the Jets themselves, because Mark Scheifele's future probably depends in part on what happens with Pierre-Luc Dubois, though I saw the NHL.com report that Cheveldayoff expects Scheifele back next year. With Dubois, the easiest thing that he could do would be to file for arbitration in July. He does that, then it guarantees he's under contract with the Winnipeg Jets for at least one more season. If he makes it to his hearing, which will likely be scheduled in August, then great. It's a one-year contract. Winnipeg has next season to try to sign him long-term as well. If he doesn't, well, Winnipeg can keep negotiating with him right up until that hearing begins. That's the simplest, most straightforward way of happening. And we only have to go back to, I think it was 2019, Kyle Connor and Patrick Laine, restricted free agents heading for major raises. It was September when those guys signed. It's not at all abnormal for a person in his situation. You saw with Mitch Marner, you can go all these high-profile RFAs. It's not uncommon for it to drag. And of course, that's inconvenient if you're Winnipeg and you're looking for certainty, but that would be realistic from Dubois' camp. Then you get into the fun stuff, which is, well, what if he doesn't see himself in Winnipeg as the long term? You can explore the offer sheet perspective if you like, but you could also explore long-term deal sign and trade, those situations. And to answer your actual question about what would it cost, I think a long-term deal for Pierre-Luc Dubois is above Kyle Connor and below 8. I think 8 by 8 makes sense. I think Winnipeg would love for Kyle Connor 7.1 whatever to be the ceiling for these guys. They might argue 93 points is untouchable for a Pierre-Luc Dubois, but as a 23-year-old center coming off of a massive year, playoff-ready game, and sort of being able to impact the game in all three zones, you're signing him for the heart of his career as well, buying free agency years. All of those things, to me, add up to something kind of approaching 8 on a long-term deal.
You know, the offer sheet's interesting. And I mean, I never spend a lot of time talking about this or thinking about it much because it so rarely ever happens in the National Hockey League. But reading the piece, knowing that he's a French background, knowing how hard the Montreal Canadiens have been dying to get that stud number one center for so long, I actually have time for the thought of potentially an aggressive move from a team like the Habs for Pierre-Luc Dubois. I would still say I think it's very, very low just because history tells us that it's the case. But you sort of explore that, Murat. And if that did happen, it would be an incredibly interesting and difficult decision, I'm sure, for the Winnipeg Jets. Well, actually, I don't think it would be that difficult depending on what the number is. But often these offer sheets, just look at the Kotkaniemi deal, are structured in a way to make it less likely for them to come in. And I mean, listen, if it's a 10-5 deal or whatever that gets to that 4 first-round pick threshold, I'm certainly for a team that's drafted like the Jets, makes them think long and hard about that return. But at the same time, a massive hole in the lineup that is just simply not replaceable if Pierre-Luc Dubois is not around next season.
Yeah, I mean, imagine the Winnipeg Jets that you just saw without Pierre-Luc Dubois on the team. That would be a devastating blow, and it would probably mark the start of a rebuild. You can get So we go through the analytics of it, and you look at 4 first-round picks. If the return in an offer sheet matches that, if it's above the 10.47, whatever the math is, but 10.5 million or above, we can say for 4 first-round picks, you can look at projected expected values of what those picks would be over the first 7 years of their term, because 7 years is what it takes to become an unrestricted free agent. So you could guarantee they'd be with the team more or less for that time. And you could compare it to what you'd project Pierre-Luc Dubois' value to be. And you can come out with the idea that, hey, actually, it's pretty close for 4 first-round picks in the range you might guess for Montreal to Pierre-Luc Dubois. At the same time, pretty close to value is all delayed. That's not coming in next season and replacing the value that Dubois brings. And it would mark if you trade Pierre-Luc Dubois, or if you let him go to an offer sheet, for me, you either have to parlay those picks into instant help, which is quite the quick pivot on Kevin Cheveldayoff's part if he can pull it, or you have to sort of say, well, hey, maybe this is a rebuild and not a retool, and maybe this is trading Connor Hellebuck and Mark Scheifele or what have you. I don't think that's Winnipeg's appetite at all. I think that they would match, but that's something to at least consider. You don't want to let that player go. To your point about the way that these things get structured, I mean, like you say, like we all know, offer sheets are rare. Well, guess who's participated in 2 of them in the last couple of years? The Montreal Canadiens have done. They saw Sebastian Aho get matched by Carolina, but then they saw Carolina come back at them with a very expensive short-term deal for Kotkaniemi that actually saw the player move. That's an interesting angle as well. There are different ways that teams can strategize in these sorts of situations. Again, like you, I don't think that it's necessarily the most likely thing that's going to happen, but it's worth thinking about because it's an option, and we should be aware of all of these things.
Murat, you mentioned our buddies Mike Zeisberger, who caught up with Cheveldayoff quickly at the scouting combine or the draft combine. And, he said, yeah, is Mark Scheifele in the plans for the team next year? He said, yeah, he is. Is that just a stock answer? Like, what else is he going to say? Or do you think that there might be more to that right now? Certainly as opposed to what most people, myself included, thought at the end of the season when we both saw and heard from so many of the players, especially Mark Scheifele in his last statements in Winnipeg.
Well, it seems as though Mark Scheifele's public comments to us, in the media, were the sorts of things. I don't want to say you can't walk them back, because you can walk just about anything back in a private conversation, further reflection, year-end exit interviews, the ones he would have had with Cheveldayoff himself, or in the time since then. Things can change, certainly, but the degree to which it was separating himself from the team, not necessarily identifying himself as like with the group of people trying to solve the problems. It was kind of Winnipeg needs to do these things, and then I'll feel good about it. That's tough stuff. That's tough to come back from, but not impossible. So I get the sense, and I guess I'll just say I get the sense that Scheifele, under certain circumstances, and I don't know what they are necessarily, could see himself returning happily for the next while. I think Winnipeg needs to be prepared for the possibility of Scheifele returning. I had one source say it's more like 80-20 that he does return, as opposed to what we all sort of believed once upon a time. But I'm not sure. I think Winnipeg has to be ready for that possibility of returning him, because you don't know yet that Pierre-Luc Dubois will sign long-term. You probably still, if you're Winnipeg, believe you can win here and now. And if you don't think you can win that trade, you might hope that coaching is what solves what needs to be solved. And a Barry Trotz type can generate that kind of accountability that stops the flybys and lets Scheifele's offensive game shine without his defensive game letting too much of it get away from him. I guess what I'm saying is I don't know, and I am more open to the idea that he stays, even if that was just Chevy saying what he needed to say.
Well, and this is a difficult question, but it's an interesting one to talk about. I do wonder how, obviously, these are your top 2 centers, and we've talked about the different contractual situations the 2 guys are in, and Mark Scheifele and Pierre-Luc Dubois. I do wonder how intertwined these decisions are made to each other. I think they obviously are in some ways, but I do wonder if you trade Mark Scheifele, or if Mark Scheifele's not going to be in the picture and Pierre-Luc Dubois is the obvious number 1 center going into next season, does that make it more likely or easier to get a deal done with Dubois for long term? Or do you go there first without doing anything on Scheifele? Because if you don't get it done, you've got far more of a need for 55, and the realistic changing of that core and moving on from that player becomes that much more tough because you don't know what's happening with your younger center.
Yeah, I think if you're Winnipeg, you need to have that dialogue with each center sort of independently. You need to get the information. You need to understand exactly what your relationship with those players is and exactly what their relationship with the team is as well. I mean, both can be phenomenal players. Scheifele has been a phenomenal player, has had delivered some excellent playoffs for Winnipeg in the past. And a Scheifele who's bought in is a phenomenal player to have on the roster. Same thing with Pierre-Luc Dubois. They'll each have their own reasons for sort of wanting to wait and see a little bit. Based on what those reasons are, you can then make the decision sort of in concert. I don't think that you need to make Pierre-Luc Dubois happy by having Scheifele in the picture or out of the picture. I don't think you need to make Scheifele happy by having Pierre-Luc Dubois in the picture or out of the picture. But you do need to have a plan. And the plan ideally involves, I mean, at least one of them, and ideally the younger one locked up long term, because you can get value for that contract. So if you, I guess, here's what I want to do. So I want to make a matrix out of this. I want to make
yes.
I want to make you have Pierre-Luc Dubois and you have Mark Scheifele matrix. That's one combination. You have Pierre-Luc Dubois long-term, you're set. That's great. He's the succession plan. You have Scheifele for the next 2 years. You're a competitive team. It's about building the best winner that you can in that time. You have to have a plan for Scheifele's next contract. Probably that contract's going to be very expensive. Maybe that's the time to let him walk or trade him next summer or what have you. But that's one situation. The other matrix is you have Dubois long term. You don't have Scheifele. Well, then you got to make that trade immediately. You have Dubois long term. Scheifele's got to go. You got to get the best that you can. Ideally, a second line center or a top six winger or what have you. You go into you don't have Dubois. You do have Scheifele. That's trouble. I mean, Dubois is going to have a tremendous value on the trade market, to be sure. I bet more teams are excited about that possibility than would be about Scheifele just because of the age. But then you have to figure out what you're going to do. If you have Scheifele moving forward, you have a top center, sure. His defense needs to improve, definitely, but the offense is there. Do you still think you're a winner? Can you find the next Pierre-Luc Dubois fast enough to win here and now, or do you have to go into rebuild mode? So for me, it's about, and I wouldn't be surprised if Kevin Cheveldayoff has all of those and more sort of outlined, because he'll have more access to what each person's exit interview looked like, and I bet you they were some pretty lengthy talks.